Select menus are definitely one of the favorite form fields, and there's so much that we can do with them, from listing out some options, specifying default values, dynamically adding them, listening to events. This lesson is dedicated to creating a select menu and binding it, of course, to Angular. Now, instead of adding it underneath our radio set, because it kind of ties in with our name, we're going to add it underneath our name field between price. So as above, let's go and create a label element. Inside of here, we want to create a span tag. So this is going to enable us to select which icon we're going to use. So if we jump into our donut model, we have an icon which is of type string. To learn a bit more, we can go into our data structure and you can see that our icon is just a slug of our name. Now it might be that we get this back from a server, or perhaps we have a directory on the server and we make a GET request and dynamically go and fetch these icon names. We don't need to get that complex. We can just assume that we are given this data. So we're in fact going to specify an array of items that we can then bind to our select. Because it doesn't matter how we get the data, what we're learning here is how to bind the data and dynamically render a select menu. So with this in mind, let's jump down to our component definition. We're then going to add a property called icons. This is simply going to be typed as a string array, so we can explicitly type this as such. Now, inside of here, we're going to provide the value of all of our assets. So inside of here, we have assets image, caramel swirl, all of these icons apart from our logo, we can then add. This will then allow us to choose them from the list. So let's start with caramel swirl. Add our glazed dash fudge, add our just dash chocolate, our sour dash supreme, our strawberry dash glaze, the vanilla dash sundae, and last but not least, our zesty lemon. So now that we have our icons, we can go ahead and start binding it to something. So what we're going to learn about is how to also use another Angular directive. And we've already covered it, but we're going to then start using it in our form as well. So this kind of gives you the flexibility of Angular. So we have our label, our span tag. Let's add a select item. Now I'm going to close this off and we can close off our select. A typical select looks something like this and we have a bunch of options inside. So first off, we need to bind our select to Angular, set up the name attribute and some classes. So let's say name equals. This is of course going to set that icon property. We can then add a class of input, much like we've done on our inputs above. For this, I have also added this select, which sets a little down and makes it look a bit nicer. So if we also add input dash dash and then select, this is then going to make things look far nicer. We want to add, of course, our ng model directive, and that's pretty much it for our select definition. The hard part is now working out how to bind our items to our options. Now, it's not actually too difficult because we already know about this directive ng4. If this perhaps crossed your mind, you're quite right in thinking so. We can specify let icon of icons, and then inside simply bind out each icon. And because this is a string array, this is then going to generate all of our text as particular items. So we can then go and select these and you can see that our JavaScript object is then updated below. Now by default, Angular is using our array as each option. And it's automatically, if we go and inspect element, taking each option and then using the value that we provide to then set the value. What if we want to set our own value? We can then use some property binding. Now you can see here that we have value and ng value. So first I'm going to use value and then we're going to swap it out to ng value and discuss why. So first, if we bind our value of icon, we can then go and select a particular item. Nothing really looks like it's changed. However, we've explicitly now set the value so we can have a bit more control. You can see we have value equals caramel swirl. If we go and take our icon, we could change things and just demonstrate with a pipe. So say we want to use the Angular uppercase pipe, we can use this pipe character, pass in uppercase, we can then save this out, go and select an item. Now our rendered list looks fine, but when we then select an item, you can see that our icon is now being set in uppercase format. So this gives us some finer grained control over what is happening, and we can obviously take our icon that we are ng4ing over and then do something with it before we are then setting it as a value. So that's value, but what about this ng value that I mentioned? If we save things out, it looks exactly the same to the untrained eye. We then have this capitalized. Now the difference actually lies in when we are setting values that are not a string. So if, for example, we were setting the number 2, you can see that this gets bound as a number. There's no quotes around it. If we then switch this over to value, this is then going to use the quotes around it. Even though we are property binding, this is just a limitation of select menus and their option counterparts. What am I suggesting here? I am suggesting that regardless of what we want to use, we might as well just adopt ng value and pass in however we want to then set that model. And this is definitely a good practice because if you think about it, we might not just have a plain JavaScript string, we might have an object. So in this case, we want to say something like icon.image if we are given that particular data structure. So by adding this ng value allows us to potentially pluck off a different property that we are then looping over. In our case, we're just dealing with a straight up string array, so this makes our lives far easier. However, you completely know now how to deal with pretty much every single use case and also why we should use ng value. So I'm going to suggest that you use ng value all the time when it comes to dealing with an option because of the way that values work. If we then want to set our own value, we can use this ng value directive, pass it in, change it, provide a pipe, whatever we want to do, format it before it then gets set into our forms model. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you really enjoyed it. I quite like working with our select menus and seeing what we can do with them. Let's dive into the next lesson and start the journey towards finishing off our form.